She's kneeling in 3-day-old snow, reading boot prints like words on a page, and what she finds sends ice through her veins colder than the Colorado winter itself. 5 killers, a burned-down home, and somewhere out there, children who may still be alive. He's been hunting the man who shot his brother in the back for over a year. She's never lost a trail in her life. Together, they're about to ride into the kind of mountains that swallow people whole. Just the two of them, no backup, no guarantee of coming back. But here's what nobody warned them about: the avalanche that nearly buries them, the moment that changes everything between them, and the choice made in the freezing dark of a mining camp that will echo through generations. This is not just a story about catching outlaws. This is a story about what two people can build when they refuse to give up, on justice, on hope, and on each other. This channel is your home for the greatest tales of the Wild West, stories of cowboys with unbreakable hearts, love forged in danger and dust, the fierce bond between a mother and her child, and the quiet grace of strangers who choose kindness when the world offers none. Today's story carries a truth worth holding on to. The greatest things in life are rarely found by playing it safe. They're found by saying yes when every instinct tells you to turn back. If this story stirs something in you, drop the word yes in the comments, because that's all it took to change everything. Share this with someone who needs to believe in love and courage again. And if you haven't yet, hit subscribe so the next story finds you right here, right where you belong.
The tracks in the snow were 3 days old, but Helena Cross could read them better than most folks read a newspaper, and the story they told sent a chill right through her in that biting December wind. She hunkered down low, her buckskin coat dusted with fresh powder, studying the trail that led away from the burned-out trading post. 2 families had made a life there right up until someone decided they were finished. Her breath puffed out in white clouds as she traced a boot print with a gloved finger. She saw the worn-down pattern on the left heel and the little drag mark that meant an injury or a limp. The depth of the print told her this fella weighed near 200 pounds and was carrying a heavy load on his back. "What are you seeing?" a voice asked from behind her, deep and cautious. Helena did not need to turn to know it was Pierce Northwood. He had swung down from his horse and was walking toward her with that careful stride of his, the kind that said he was ready for trouble but did not want to cause any. She had been tracking for his outfit for 3 weeks now. It started back in Central City, where she had been looking for work. She found the tall cowboy with serious gray eyes standing outside the marshal's office, staring at a wanted poster, like he had a personal grudge against it. "5 men," she said, getting to her feet and dusting the snow from her pants. "The one out front is the leader. He walks sure of himself, not even glancing back at his crew. The others are strung out behind him, so they are not army men, just a regular gang of outlaws. They are headed northeast, up into the high country. That is a fool's errand in this weather, unless they know a shortcut we do not." Pierce came and stood beside her so close she could feel his warmth against the freezing air. Together they looked out at the endless white of the Rocky Mountains in winter. It was 1885, and this part of Colorado was still wild. A man could vanish here and never be seen again, which is exactly what these fellas were banking on. The only problem for them was that Helena Cross had been learning to track since she could walk, taught by her Shoshone mother and her trapper father. She had never lost a trail, no matter how cold or dangerous it got. "We ought to turn back," Pierce said, but he did not sound convinced. "The others are back in Central City. We could round up more men, get more supplies. Head back out in the spring when the passes are open." Helena turned and gave him a good, long look. She took in the strong set of his jaw, the worry lines on his forehead, and the way his hand rested on his gun belt out of pure habit, not threat. He was maybe 25 to her 22, with sandy brown hair that curled over his collar and shoulders broad enough to make a woman feel safe without making her feel helpless. She had liked that about him right from the start. He respected her skill for what it was. He never once doubted her just because she was a woman who wore her dark hair in a long braid. "Those families had children," she said softly. The Hutchinsons had a baby girl not even a year old. The Prescotts had 3 boys. The oldest was only 9. If there's any chance they are still alive, any chance at all those men took them instead of leaving them behind, we cannot wait for spring. Something in Pierce's face changed then, a look of firm decision. It told her he had been hoping she would say just that he was testing his own nerve more than hers. He gave a single sharp nod, and his voice was steady when he spoke again. Then we ride. But Helena, there is something you need to know. These men we are after, they are part of Jacob Steele's gang. Jacob Steele is the whole reason I came to Colorado. He killed my brother in Wyoming last year, shot him in the back during a bank robbery, and just left him there to die in the street. I have been hunting him ever since. The words hung between them in the cold air, heavy with truth. Helena felt a pang in her chest, a feeling that she understood his pain all too well. She reached out and touched his arm for just a moment, feeling his solid strength through his coat. Then we have got 2 reasons to catch them, she said. Justice for your brother, and hope for those children. But Pierce, if we are doing this, heading into the high country in the dead of winter with just the 2 of us, we are putting our lives in each other's hands. You are going to have to trust me all the way, and I am going to have to do the same with you. He looked her right in the eye, and she saw something in his gaze that made her heart beat a little faster, something more than just an agreement. I already trust you, he said. You track better than any scout I have ever known. Better than the men the Army hired when I was a ranger down in Texas. Better than the old mountain men who have been at it for 50 years. The minute I saw you studying those prints outside the marshal's office, I knew you were the one who could help me find Steele. So I am asking you now, Helena Cross, will you ride with me this winter? Will you help me hunt these men through snow and storm, knowing it could get us both killed? Knowing we might not see civilization again before the worst of it hits? The smart thing to do was say no. The sensible thing was to go back to Central City and wait for spring, to let the marshal put together a proper posse with all the right gear. But Helena had never been the sensible type, and something in Pierce's voice, the way he looked at her like she was the answer to a prayer he was too proud to speak, made her choice simple. I will ride with you, she said, this winter and for however long it takes. But we are doing it my way. We track smart. We stay ahead of the storms, and we do not take foolish chances. Those men might be killers, but they are not worth dying for if we can help it. A real smile spread across Pierce's face then, making him look younger, and he held out his hand. Helena took it, feeling his strong grip even through their gloves. They shook on it like partners, like equals, like 2 people about to walk straight into a fight together, and both dead set on walking back out. They pushed their horses hard for the rest of the day, following the tracks as they twisted through snow-covered pine forests, across frozen streams that they had to cross with care, and up steep slopes that made the horses pant and struggle. Pierce rode a good horse, a tough chestnut gelding named Ranger that looked like he was built to last. Helena was on her own mount, a scrappy little paint mare named Storm, who had carried her over half the West without a single complaint. The 2 horses seemed to get on just fine, finding an easy pace as they climbed higher into the mountains. As the daylight started to fade, painting the snow in shades of blue and purple, Helena found a sheltered spot under a rock ledge where the wind could not get to them, and the snow was not too deep. Pierce went to gather firewood while she saw to the horses, rubbing them down, giving them their blankets, and making sure they had plenty of dried grass from their supplies. By the time he had a small fire going, tucked in just right so the smoke would break up against the rock and not give them away, it was pitch dark, and the temperature was dropping like a stone. They ate a simple meal. Hardtack and jerky and coffee that was strong enough to jolt a dead man awake. They did not talk much since sound travels far in the mountains, and they could not afford to get careless. But Helena was very aware of Pierce sitting across the fire. She watched the way the flames threw shadows on his face, and the way he moved with a quiet purpose, even in their small camp. She had traveled with men before, worked with trackers and hunters and cowboys, but there was something else about Pierce Northwood. Something that made her notice every time he glanced her way, every time their hands brushed when they reached for the coffee pot. "Tell me about your folks," he finally said, his voice low and raspy from the cold. "You said your mother was Shoshone. Was she the one who taught you to track?" Helena cradled her tin cup, thankful for its warmth, and let herself think of her mother for the first time in a good while. "She was Shoshone, yes. She passed when I was 16. A fever got her one winter when we were camped up near the Green River. But before that, she taught me everything she knew about reading the land, about understanding what the tracks and signs were saying. My father was a French trapper who came out west back in the 30s, before the beaver trade went bust. He taught me how to shoot, how to skin game, and how to get by out here in the wild. Between the two of them, I learned how to take care of myself." "And your father?" Pierce asked gently. "Is he still around?" Helena shook her head. "He died 2 years back. His heart just stopped one night. I buried him in the mountains he loved so much, and I have been wandering ever since. I have worked as a tracker, a guide, a scout for wagon trains. I have done what I had to do to keep food on the table. And protected. It is a hard life, for sure, but it is the one I know, and I would not give it up for anything." Pierce went quiet for a spell, just looking into the flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and thoughtful. "In some ways, I'm a bit jealous of that. The kind of freedom you have, the things you know how to do. I was raised on a ranch down in Texas, learned how to work cattle and be a cowboy. It was a good life, honest work, but I always had a path laid out for me, a part I was expected to play. When my brother Daniel went north to find his own way, I was meant to stay behind and help run the place. But after he was gone, after Steele murdered him, I could not just do nothing. My folks, they wanted me to let the anger go, saying Daniel would not want me to waste my life hunting down his killer. But how was I supposed to go back to working cattle when the man that shot my brother in the back was still out there, robbing folks and taking lives?" Helena could hear the hurt in his voice, a tangled mess of guilt and fury. She knew that feeling all too well from when her own parents had passed away. That feeling of being adrift, of having to find a new reason to keep going after a great loss. "Your brother would be proud of you for wanting justice," she said in a soft voice. "That is not the same as revenge. There is a difference, you know." "Is there, though?" Pierce looked up at her, and the firelight made his eyes look haunted. "Some days I just don't know anymore. Some days I think I am just plain angry, just hurting, and I have dressed it up with fancy words like justice and duty. Anything to make myself feel better about wanting to put a bullet right through Jacob Steele's heart." Helena set her coffee cup down and moved around the fire. She settled right next to Pierce, so close their shoulders were touching. It was a bold move, likely improper by town standards, but they were a long way from polite society up here in the high country, with killers on their trail and a hard winter breathing down their necks. "You listen to me," she said, her voice firm. "The fact that you even ask yourself that question, that you worry about the line between justice and revenge, that proves you are a good man. A man only out for vengeance would not even care. He would not give it a second thought. You are hunting Steele because he is a killer that has to be stopped. And yes, because he took your brother from you. It is all right for both of those things to be true." Pierce turned his head to look at her, and she was surprised by how near his face was to hers. He was close enough for her to see the little blue specks in his gray eyes and a faint scar on his jaw she had never seen before. "Where did you get to be so wise?" he asked. And something in his tone made her hold her breath. "I am not wise," she replied. "I am just stubborn, is all. And I have learned that life is too short and too difficult to be wasted on what-ifs and second-guessing. We are here. We are doing this, and we will see it through to the end. Together." "Together," Pierce repeated. And then he did something that took her by surprise. He reached up and gently tucked a stray piece of hair behind her ear. His gloved fingers were soft against her cold skin. The gesture was so unexpectedly tender, so personal, that a warmth spread through Helena that had nothing to do with the campfire. They sat like that for a long moment, quiet and close, and Helena could feel the air thick with unspoken possibilities. But then a sudden gust of wind blew snow into their little shelter, breaking the spell. They both pulled away, suddenly remembering where they were and what they were about. Pierce cleared his throat and got to his feet, muttering something about checking on the horses. Helena let him go, her heart thumping in her chest while she tried to make sense of what just took place. She did not get much sleep that night, and she had a feeling Pierce did not either. They took their turns on watch, speaking only when they had to as they swapped shifts. When the sun finally came up, cold and bright, they were both tired and sore. Still, they broke camp like clockwork and were moving again within the hour. The tracks they followed took them higher and higher into mountains where the snow was deep enough to make every step a struggle. The air grew so thin that both the horses and the riders had to stop often just to breathe. But Helena could tell the men they were chasing were having a rough time of it too. Their trails showed they were getting tired, with spots where a man had fallen and places where they had to stop and rest more and more often. No matter what Steele and his crew were running to, they were not having an easy journey. "They are headed for an old mining camp," Helena said around noon, while they stopped on a ridge to look at the land up ahead. "You see how their trail follows that creek bed? There was a silver rush in these mountains back in the 60s and 70s. Most of the camps are ghost towns now, but some of the buildings might still be up. Steele is likely planning to hide out there for the winter, hoping to wait us out in a real shelter." Pierce squinted, using his hand to block the glare from the snow. "If they make it to that camp before we do, we have lost our edge. They will be dug in good and trying to get them out. Will be next to impossible with just the two of us." "Then we have got to move faster," Helena said. "I know a way, a shortcut my father showed me a long time ago. It is risky. We would have to cross a slope that could slide out from under us if we are not careful, but it will get us ahead of Steele's bunch. We could reach the mining camp first." Pierce looked at her, weighing the danger, and then he gave a firm nod. "You are the expert tracker. I will follow where you lead." They turned their horses and started the slow, careful climb up toward the high pass. The wind up there was fierce, strong enough to knock you right over if you were not ready for it. The snow was hard and slick, hiding rocks and holes that could easily snap a horse's leg. Helena took the lead, checking every footstep, keeping her eyes on the slopes above them for any sign of a slide. Pierce followed right in her path behind her, putting all his trust in her. The weight of that faith felt heavy on her shoulders. They were about halfway across the pass when Helena heard it, a low rumble that seemed to come from inside the mountain itself. She stopped dead, throwing her hand up to signal for Pierce to halt. For one heart-stopping moment, they both stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe as the sound echoed through the surrounding peaks. Then, ever so slowly, Helena started moving again, making her way toward a group of large rocks that might give them some cover if the worst was to happen. They almost got there. They were just 20 feet from the rocks when the whole slope above them broke loose with a sound like cannon fire. In an instant, the world turned into white fury, a crushing wave of snow and ice pouring down on them with terrifying power. Helena heard Pierce yell her name, felt her horse Storm jump beneath her, and then she was running on pure survival instinct, kicking the mare hard to outrun the avalanche to the flimsy safety of the rocks. She made it. Storm leaped the last few feet, and Helena dove from the saddle, tumbling behind the cover of the boulders as the avalanche thundered past. It was a solid wall of white destruction that choked the air with ice, and a sound that hurt her ears. She covered her head with her arms, hugged the cold rock, and prayed with all her might that Pierce had made it too. The silence that came after the avalanche was almost as loud as the roar itself. Helena's ears were ringing, and her whole body ached from where she hit the rocks. But she was alive. She pushed herself to her feet, spitting snow out of her lungs, and frantically looked around for Pierce. "Helena." His voice came from her left, hoarse and weak. She spun around and saw him climbing out from behind another outcropping of rocks. He was covered in snow, but he seemed to be in one piece, A wave of relief washed over her so strong it made her legs feel like jelly. Before she could stop herself, she was running to him, stumbling through the deep snow the slide had left behind. Pierce met her halfway, and then his arms were wrapped around her, and hers were wrapped around him. They just held on to each other with all their might, alive together, and trembling from the fear they had just survived. "I thought you were gone," Pierce said into her hair, his voice choked with emotion. "I thought the snow had buried you." "I am here," Helena whispered, her face buried in his chest, feeling his heart pounding just as fast as her own. "I am here. We are both here. We made it." They held on for a long time, and Helena knew that something important had just changed between them. They had crossed a line you could not see, and there was no way to go back. When Pierce finally eased back enough to look down at her, his hands still gripping her shoulders, his face was open and serious. "Helena," he started, saying her name like it was important. "I have got to tell you something, and I am telling you now because we nearly died and life is just too short to be a coward. From the very first moment I saw you, when you knelt down in the middle of the street and read those tracks like they were an open book, I have felt a pull toward you. Your toughness, your skill, your courage. This last week, riding with you, tracking with you, has been the best week I have had since Daniel was killed. You make me feel like maybe there is something more to live for than just getting even, something beyond just staying alive. I know this is not the right time or the right place. I know we are in the middle of a hunt, out here in the wild chasing down murderers, but I had to say it. I needed you to know that you mean more to me than I likely have any right to admit." A hitch caught in Helena's breathing as she looked up at him. This man had somehow slipped past all her walls, and she hadn't even seen it happen. "Pierce," she whispered, "I feel the same. I have fought it, tried to keep everything professional, and told myself over and over that we are just partners on a job. But the honest truth is, when I thought that avalanche might have taken you, when I thought you could be gone, it scared me in a way I have not been scared in years. You have become important. You are someone I cannot stand the thought of losing." Pierce's eyes searched her face, and then he slowly leaned in, giving her plenty of time to move away, and kissed her. His lips felt cold from the biting wind, but they were gentle and asking a question. Helena gave him his answer by rising onto her toes and kissing him right back. Her gloved hands grabbed the front of his coat, pulling him in closer. The kiss was short, hardly anything at all by most standards, but it felt like a promise. It felt like the start of something. When they finally pulled apart, they were both smiling, forgetting the cold, the danger, and the mess they were in. "We ought to find the horses," Helena said, her voice a little shaky, "and make sure they made it through that rock slide. After that, we need to get moving again because Steele is still out there and those kids might still be alive." Pierce let out a laugh, a sound of pure happiness that bounced across the snow-filled pass. "You are absolutely right about that, but, Helena, once this is all settled, when we have caught Steele and found those children, if they can still be found, I am going to court you the right way. I will take you out for a fine dinner in Central City, and I will ask your permission to come calling on you. We are going to do this proper." "I would like that very much," Helena said, her smile growing even wider. "But for now, we have a job to finish." They located both horses safe and sound, as the animals had enough sense to bolt for cover when they heard the avalanche start. After giving them a good look over, they pressed on across the pass. The rest of the journey went by without any trouble, and by the time afternoon was fading, they were heading down the other side. They followed a tight path that twisted through a thick pine forest, where the snow was not so deep and the wind did not have such a bite. Helena's bet on the shortcut had worked. Just as the sun was starting to dip below the mountains, they came upon the old mining camp. It was a small gathering of worn-down buildings all crowded around the opening of a silver mine that had long since been emptied. The camp was deserted, with no sign that anyone had been there recently. Helena felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing they had made it to this place before Steele and his men. "They will likely get here tomorrow, probably around mid-morning, if they keep up their pace," she said. She and Pierce stood in the long shadow of a building, looking over all the ways to approach the camp. That gives us tonight to get ready, to come up with a plan for how the two of us are going to deal with 5 armed men. Pierce was silent for a spell, his gaze sweeping over the land. Helena could nearly see the gears turning in his head as he planned. "We have the element of surprise," he finally said. "And we have you. And you can shoot better than any man I have ever known. What we do not have is the legal power to arrest them or the numbers to make them surrender. So we are going to have to be smart about this." They used the next few hours to prepare, and Helena found herself impressed by Pierce's way of thinking about a fight. He had clearly been in this kind of fix before, situations where you had to be clever because you were outnumbered rather than just using force. They chose the most defensible building to hold up in, one that gave them a clear view of every approach and had a back way out if they needed to make a run for it. They dragged fallen timber to create barriers that would force any attackers into places where they would be exposed. They checked their guns again and again, counted every last bullet, and made certain they had water and supplies close at hand. Once everything was set, with nothing left to do but wait, they built a small fire inside the building. They planned to take turns standing watch through the night. Helena took the first watch, sitting by a window that looked out on the trail where they figured Steele would appear. Pierce laid out near the fire, trying to get a little rest. But about an hour into her watch, Helena heard him stir. A moment later, he was sitting right there beside her, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, staring into the dark with her. "Could not get to sleep?" she asked in a low voice. "Did not want to," he answered. "I would much rather spend this time with you. We can talk if you feel like talking, or just sit here quiet if you would rather do that." A warmth spread through Helena's chest, and she leaned just enough for her shoulder to press against his. "Tell me about your home in Texas," she said. "Tell me about your ranch and your people. I want to know where you are from and who you were before you got into all of this." So Pierce told her, his voice quiet and sure, in the dark room. He talked about being raised on a cattle ranch and how he learned to ride a horse before he could even walk right. He spoke of the never-ending work and the simple good things about that kind of life. He told her about his folks, hard-working and kind, who had made something out of nothing and were proud of it. He told her about his older brother, Daniel, who was always restless and wanting more than the ranch could give. Daniel had headed north to chase his fortune. "Daniel was my opposite in every way," Pierce said, and his voice was full of both love and sadness. "He had all the charm while I had all the seriousness. He was a dreamer, and I was a realist. Folks just took to him, wanted to be near him. When he took off for Wyoming, I missed him something awful every single day. But I was proud of him, too, because he was finally going after what he wanted. Then one day, about 6 months after he had gone, we got a telegram. There had been a bank robbery in Laramie. A man was shot down in the street. Daniel was dead at 26. The telegram was short on details, but I started asking questions. And after a while, I found out what really happened. Jacob Steele and his gang hit that bank, and Daniel just happened to be walking by at the worst possible time. He must have seen something, or maybe Steele just thought he did. And Steele shot him, just like that. 1 second my brother was alive, and the next he was gone. He was killed by a man who likely forgot his face before the sun went down." Helena reached over and took Pierce's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "I am so very sorry," she said. "That is a horrible thing, a horrible way to lose a person you care about." "It was," Pierce said quietly, "and it changed who I was. I could not stay on the ranch. I could not act like the world was still right. So I gave my mother a kiss goodbye, shook my father's hand, and I pointed my horse north. I have been on Steele's trail ever since, from Wyoming all the way to Montana and now to here. I got close a couple of times, but he always managed to slip through my fingers. But not this time. This time, I have you with me. And for once we are ahead of him instead of chasing his dust. This time, maybe I can finally get justice for Daniel." "You will," Helena said with conviction. "We will do it together." After that, They sat there in a comfortable quiet, watching the stars move across the sky through breaks in the clouds. And Helena started thinking about what a strange and winding road life is. Just a month before, she had been completely on her own, moving from one town to the next with no real reason other than to get by. And now, here she was, high up in the winter mountains, getting ready to face down a gang of killers. And in all of it, she had stumbled upon something she had not even realized she was missing. She had found a connection with someone, a real purpose, and the very beginning of a feeling that might just turn into love. The sun came up cold and bright, painting the mountain peaks in shades of rose and gold. Helena and Pierce got ready for what was coming. They had a fast breakfast, checked their guns one last time, and then they settled in to wait. The waiting was the most difficult part, watching time crawl by as the sun climbed higher in the sky. The morning wore on with no sign of Steele or his men. It was a little past 10 o'clock in the morning when Helena saw them. Movement down on the trail. She put a hand on Pierce's arm and pointed. They both watched as 5 riders came out of the trees and started heading toward the old mining camp. From this far away, Helena could still tell how they carried themselves. They were worn out and cold, moving with the slow, steady pace of men who had been pushing hard and were glad to finally be reaching their stop. "That is them," Pierce said, his voice low and tight with feeling. "The fella out front, the one on the gray horse. That is Jacob Steele. I know his face from the wanted posters, from all the descriptions I have heard." Helena took a long, hard look at the man. He was about average height with broad shoulders, dark hair, and a beard that looked like it had been trimmed up once upon a time, but was now shaggy from the trail. He rode like a man who was used to being in charge, used to giving orders and having people jump to obey. The 4 men riding with him looked younger, meaner. They were the kind of men who made their living with a gun and likely did not ever lose a wink of sleep over it. "I do not see any children," Helena said, and her heart sank right down to her boots. If they are the ones who took the Hutchinson and Prescott kids, they are not with them now. Pierce's jaw went rigid. "Which means they either left them behind somewhere," he said, "or they killed them, or sold them," Helena finished, her voice grim. It was a dreadful thought, but a real one. Some folks will pay good money for children with no questions asked about where they came from. We had to take at least one of these men alive, make him talk. The outlaws came into the camp feeling mighty sure of themselves. They clearly were not expecting any trouble. They swung down from their horses in front of a big building, probably the old bunkhouse from when the mine was running, and started to unload their packs. Helena could hear them talking and laughing, the sound carrying on the cold air, all relaxed now that they figured they were safe. Pierce and Helena waited until every last one of the 5 men was inside, and then they made their move. They had planned it all out, going over the details again and again through the night. They came in from different sides, circling the building to cover the front and back doors. They made sure no one could slip out without being seen. Helena found a spot behind a pile of old lumber with a perfect view of the front door, while Pierce settled in near the back. "Jacob Steele," Pierce's voice boomed across the camp, strong and steady. "This here is Pierce Northwood. You're wanted for murder up in Wyoming, and for that attack on the trading post 3 days south of here. Come on out with your hands in the air, and we'll bring you in alive." For a second, there was just dead silence. Then all hell broke loose inside that building. Helena heard shouting and the sound of men scrambling for their guns. Then bullets started tearing through the thin wooden walls. She kept her head down, staying patient and waiting for her chance. It came when one of the outlaws, a younger fellow who was clearly scared out of his wits, busted out the front door holding a rifle. Helena didn't want to put him down for good, so she aimed for his shoulder and squeezed the trigger. Her shot hit its mark. The man hollered and dropped his rifle, grabbing his arm. Helena was up and moving in a flash, kicking the weapon away before pointing her own gun right at him. "Stay put," she commanded, and the tone in her voice must have been convincing because he just dropped to his knees, his face pale with pain and shock. More gunshots rang out, this time from the back of the building, and a jolt of fear for Pierce went through Helena's heart. But then she heard his voice, strong and unharmed, telling someone to drop their weapon, and she could breathe a little easier. The standoff stretched on for another 10 minutes, a tense and dangerous waiting game. The men inside fired a shot every now and then and hollered threats, but Pierce and Helena held their positions, refusing to get drawn into a long firefight. At last, one of the outlaws decided to make a run for it, charging out the back door and trying to scramble up the snowy hill behind the camp. Pierce fired a warning shot that sent snow flying just inches from the man's boots. The outlaw froze dead in his tracks and slowly put his hands up. "That's 2 down," Helena called over to Pierce. "3 more to go." What finally broke the stalemate was something they hadn't counted on. A little wisp of smoke started curling up from the bunkhouse, and Helena realized with a sudden chill that someone inside had either knocked over a lantern or set a fire on purpose. In just a few minutes, flames were chewing through the old, dry timber. The last 3 men had a simple choice. They could either burn up or give up. They chose to give up. First, one man staggered out, coughing with his hands held high, and then another followed. Finally, Jacob Steele himself came out. His face was a mask of stone, and his hands were raised, but his eyes burned with pure fury. Pierce stepped forward to tie him up, and Helena could see the strain in every muscle of Pierce's body as he came face to face with his brother's killer. "You've made a terrible mistake, cowboy," Steele growled, his voice scratchy from the smoke. "You've got no authority out here, no badge, nothing. This ain't an arrest, it's kidnapping." "You're going back to Central City," Pierce said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You're going to stand trial for murder, for robbery, for every last bit of it. And you're going to tell us what happened to the Hutchinson and Prescott families and what you did with those children." For a moment, something shifted in Steele's eyes. It might have been guilt, or maybe just him figuring his next move. "The children are alive," he said. "We left them at a trading post a 2-day ride northeast of here with the woman who runs it. We took the family's money, but we didn't kill any kids. We're thieves, not child killers." Relief flooded through Helena so strong it nearly made her buckle at the knees. The children were alive. After all the worrying and not knowing, the children were alive. The trip back to Central City took 5 long days, and it was one of the hardest things Helena had ever been through. They had 5 prisoners to handle, not nearly enough supplies, and a winter that seemed set on finishing them all off. But somehow they did it. They trudged through snowstorms and freezing nights, made their food last, and kept a constant watch on the outlaws who tried to escape a couple of times, but never with much real effort. Pierce was a different man on that ride back, more quiet and lost in his own thoughts. He would watch Jacob Steele for hours, and Helena could just see the war he was fighting inside himself, the need for revenge clashing with the good man he was. She stayed near him, offering support without words. Just letting her being there remind him that he wasn't alone, that he didn't have to bear this weight all by himself. They made a stop at the trading post Steele had told them about, and found the Hutchinson and Prescott children alive and well. They were being looked after by a tough old gal named Martha, who'd clearly been scared stiff of what the outlaws might do if she didn't help them. The reunion between the children and the news that their parents didn't make it was a heartbreaking thing to see, but at least those children were safe. At least they'd get a chance to live. When they finally rode into Central City with their prisoners and the rescued kids, it felt like the entire town came out to see them. The marshal took custody of Steele and his crew, and folks made arrangements for the children to stay with families who would look after them. Helena and Pierce gave their statements, handed over all the evidence they had, and then, bone-tired and wrung out, they finally got a chance to rest. Pierce came looking for her that evening at the boarding house she was staying at. He knocked gently on her door and waited for her to open it. When she opened the door and saw him standing there, all cleaned up and shaven, looking more unsure of himself than she'd ever seen, her heart just about swelled up in her chest. "I know I said I was going to court you proper," Pierce started, getting right to the point. "And I mean to. But I have to say this right now before another minute goes by. Helena Cross, You are the bravest, most capable, and most incredible woman I have ever had the privilege to know. Riding with you this winter, hunting those men, and facing down killers and avalanches and everything else this land threw at us. It's been the greatest honor of my life. You saved those children. You helped me bring my brother's killer to justice, and somewhere on that trail, you saved me too. You reminded me that there's more to this life than just getting even, more to being alive than just getting by. I'm falling in love with you, and I just had to let you know. Helena felt tears welling up in her eyes. They were tears of pure joy, relief, and just being overwhelmed with feeling. She reached out and took Pierce's hand, gently pulling him inside her room and closing the door. I'm falling in love with you too, she said, her voice a little shaky. You're a good man, Pierce Northwood. One of the finest I've ever met. You're strong and brave and honorable, and you treat me like I'm your equal, your partner. I've spent most of my life on my own, and I always figured I liked it that way. But then I met you, and all of a sudden being alone doesn't seem half as good as being together. Pierce gathered her into his arms and held her tight. They just stood there for a good long while, breathing in sync, feeling the simple happiness of being alive, safe, and in each other's arms. When he finally kissed her, it wasn't a rushed or desperate kiss like the one on the mountain. This one was slow and gentle and full of promises, a kiss that whispered about new starts and tomorrows, and all the days they were going to share. Over the next few months, Pierce was true to his word. He courted Helena the right way. He took her to suppers and town dances, walked with her through the streets of Central City, and introduced her to folks as his girl, with a pride in his voice that no one could miss. The town took a liking to her, maybe because she'd helped take down Jacob Steele's gang, or maybe just because anybody with eyes could see that she and Pierce were meant for each other. The trial for Jacob Steele was held in February, and both Helena and Pierce stood up and told their story. Steele was found guilty of murder, robbery, and kidnapping on several accounts, and the judge sentenced him to hang. Pierce went to the execution. He stood there silent and still, as the man who took his brother's life paid the price for his crimes. And when it was all over, he seemed lighter, like a heavy burden he'd been carrying for months had finally been set down. Spring came to the mountains in a rush of melting snow, and new green shoots pushing up through the last of the white, and with that, everything started to change. Pierce took Helena up on a hillside that looked out over Central City, with all of Colorado stretching out before them, and asked for her hand. She said yes in a heartbeat. They got married that April in a quiet little wedding at the town church. It seemed like half of Central City turned out for it, and Martha from the trading post stood up as Helena's witness. Pierce had sold off his family's ranch back in Texas, and used that money to buy a good piece of land right outside Central City. It was prime grazing land, with plenty of water and enough trees to block the worst of the winter winds. He and Helena made a life there, raising cattle and horses, and Helena kept taking on tracking jobs. Whenever they popped up, she was just too good at it and loved it too much to give it up completely. Pierce never once told her she should. He knew her skills were a deep part of who she was, and he loved every bit of her, not just the parts that made for a good rancher's wife. Their first baby, a strong little boy they named Daniel after Pierce's brother, was born the next winter. Helena was in labor all night long with a midwife from town helping her, and Pierce wore a path in the dirt outside until Martha finally had mercy on him and let him inside to hold his wife's hand. When Daniel finally made his appearance all red and squalling, Pierce cried tears of pure joy. He held his son so gently and carefully that Helena fell in love with him all over again right then and there. Life wasn't always a walk in the park. They saw some brutal winters and bone-dry summers. They had cattle get sick and good horses go lame. Money got tight sometimes, and there were about 1,000 other little things that made running a ranch so hard. But Helena and Pierce handled everything that came their way as a team, and they built something that was solid and meant to last. They had two more children in the next few years, a daughter they named Rose, and another boy they called James. The ranch did well, growing from just a small outfit into one of the most successful in the whole area. Pierce earned a name for himself as a man who was fair and square, someone you could count on. Helena became well known too, and not just for her tracking, but as a woman who could figure out problems. She could find livestock that had wandered off or people who were lost. She could read the land in a way that felt like pure magic to folks who didn't understand the craft behind it. The Hutchinson and Prescott kids, the very ones they had rescued that winter, grew up right there in Central City with families that adored them. Helena and Pierce kept up with them through the years, and it brought them both a deep sense of peace to see those children grow up strong, knowing their wild ride into those mountains truly mattered. Every now and then, on a winter night with the wind howling outside and the fire snapping in the fireplace, Helena would find her mind drifting back to that December day. She'd remember kneeling in the snow studying those tracks, while Pierce stood right behind her and asked for her help. She would think about the snowslide, the kiss on that mountain, and the moment they stood together against a couple of killers and walked away. Then she would look across the room at Pierce, maybe wrestling with one of the kids, or reading a book, or just staring into the flames. And a powerful feeling of thanks for the way her life turned out would wash over her. Sometimes Pierce would catch her gaze, and he would give her that smile, the very one that had changed his whole serious face that first night up in the mountains. And in that look she knew he was thinking the exact same thing, that they had found each other when the odds were stacked against them, that they had built something real and true, and that they had taken all the hard, broken parts of their pasts and pieced them together into something wonderful. As the years rolled by, the ranch became more than a business. It turned into a true home, a place where friends and neighbors would gather, and a testament to what you could build with hard work and a good partner. Pierce taught their kids how to ride and rope, passing down the same values his own folks had taught him. Helena taught them how to track, how to understand the land, and how to see their own place in the natural world. Together they raised children who were strong, capable, and kind, who knew their own value and treated other folks with respect. When Daniel was 10, Rose was 8, and James was 6, a young woman showed up at the ranch seeking a job. Her name was Sarah Prescott, and she was one of the very children they had saved all those years ago. She was 18 now, sharp as a tack and not afraid of hard work, and she had her heart set on learning how to ranch. Helena and Pierce took her in without a second thought. They gave her work and a roof over her head, and watching her grow and succeed filled them both with a deep sense of coming full circle. Sarah stayed on for 3 years, soaking up everything she could. When she finally left, it was to start her own little ranch with a young fella she had met in town. At her wedding, she stood up and thanked Helena and Pierce in front of everyone, telling the whole crowd that they had saved her life not once, but twice. The first time was when she was just a girl, and the second time was when they gave her the skills and the belief in herself to make her own way in the world. Pierce reached for Helena's hand during that speech and gave it a gentle squeeze, and she squeezed right back. Both of their minds went back to that hard winter ride, to the fear and the biting cold and the danger. They felt a wave of gratitude that they had taken that chance, that they had ridden into those mountains together when it would have been so much simpler to just turn away. The years kept turning, marked by the changing seasons, by new babies and sad goodbyes, by years of drought and years of plenty, and by all the simple little moments that string together to make a life. Daniel grew into a strong, no-nonsense young man, a lot like his father, but with his mother's special gift for reading the land. As Pierce got on in years, his son started taking the reins of the ranch, handling more and more of the work. He had a real knack for it, a quiet capability that made his folks swell with pride. Rose, well, she had a fire in her soul and her mother's steady aim with a rifle, not to mention her father's unshakable sense of right and wrong. She went on to be a school teacher, determined to give the children of Central City and all the surrounding spreads a proper education. James was the smooth talker, the one with a quick laugh and a gift for making folks feel at ease. It was only natural that he went into business, setting up a mercantile in town that kept the ranchers supplied with every last thing they needed. Helena and Pierce watched the years go by together, the silver creeping into their hair, and the map of their journey etching itself onto their faces. Their bodies showed the signs of a life that was hard-fought, but deeply rewarding. But they were still the same steadfast partners who had charged into those mountains with nothing but grit and faith. They still held hands in the quiet of the evening, still shared a kiss before sleep, and still looked at each other with that deep love and respect that only comes from knowing another person's heart completely. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Pierce took Helena right back to that hillside overlooking Central City, the very spot where he had asked for her hand. The seasons had turned, and it was spring once more with the mountainsides lush and green. They sat together, side by side, watching the sun paint the sky as it set behind the peaks they had dared to cross so long ago. "You ever have second thoughts?" Pierce asked, his voice soft. "About riding with me that winter, about taking that gamble when we nearly lost it all to that snowslide, or facing down Steele and his crew?" Helena gave it some real thought, because a question like that from Pierce deserved a real answer. Then she shook her head. "Not for one single second," she said, her voice firm. "That ride changed my whole life. It gave me everything I have now. You, our kids, this ranch, this whole life. Before I met you, I was just drifting, getting by but not truly living. You gave me a reason, a partner, and love. So no, I don't regret a thing. I would do it all over again in a heartbeat." Pierce pulled her in close and kissed the top of her head. "You could track better than any scout I ever knew," he said, his words echoing what he had told her so long ago. "And you could love better than anyone I ever dreamed of. Thank you, Helena. Thank you for saying yes when I asked you to ride with me that winter. Thank you for being my partner, my wife, and my best friend. Thank you for building this whole life with me." Helena turned in his embrace and gave him a proper kiss, a deep one filled with all the love and fire of 20 years of being married. "Thank you for asking," she whispered against his lips. "Thank you for really seeing me, for valuing what I could do, and for loving me for exactly who I am." They stayed right there until the sky was completely dark, wrapped up in each other's arms. They were two people who had found one another against impossible odds and had built something that would endure long after they were gone. Down below them, the lights of Central City began to flicker on in the growing night. And somewhere among those lights were their children, their friends, and their community. What they had built was a legacy, not just of land and cattle, but of lives they had touched and wrongs they had righted, of a love they gave out freely that came right back to them. As they finally got up to head for home, Pierce took Helena's hand. They walked together down that hillside just the way they had walked through their whole life together. As partners, as equals, as two souls who had found in the other everything they had ever searched for, and more than they had ever dared to imagine. The ranch kept doing well under Daniel's watch, and in time his own kids, Pierce and Helena's grandchildren, started learning the ropes, both literally and figuratively. The circle of life continued, with new generations building on what came before, and at the very heart of it all was the story of two people who had ridden into the mountains in the dead of winter and came back out with their lives, their honor, and their love all in one piece. Helena lived long enough to see her grandchildren grow up, and to see the ranch she and Pierce started become one of the most respected outfits in all of Colorado. She lived to see Central City grow from a rough-and-tumble mining camp into a real town with schools and churches and laws that people actually followed. And through every single bit of it, she had Pierce right there with her partner in every way that mattered. He was the man who saw her skills and knew their worth, who asked her to ride with him, and then spent the rest of his days being thankful that she had said yes. When Pierce drew his last breath in his sleep at the ripe old age of 72, It was a calm and fitting end to a long life that had truly mattered, with Helena holding his hand and their children all around. Helena mourned him with all her heart, the way any woman would for the one great love of her life, but she carried no regrets. She had nearly 30 years with him, building a home and a family, and she knew a kind of deep and true love that most folks only dream about. She went on for another 5 years after Pierce was gone, staying right there on the ranch, giving Daniel advice when he came asking, but mostly just letting him handle things in his own way. She still took on tracking jobs now and again when somebody needed finding, because some skills you just never lose. She was, after all, still better at reading a trail than most fellas half her age. And she'd tell her grandkids the old stories, tales about their grandpa, about the winter the two of them rode up into the mountains, and about snow slides and bad men, and how they found love when they least expected it. When Helena's time finally came on a quiet spring morning, she passed in her sleep with the windows wide open, letting in the smell of pine and wildflowers. Her family grieved, but they also celebrated. They celebrated a life lived to the fullest, a woman who was a force of nature, who kicked down doors and blazed her own trails and loved with everything she had. They laid her to rest next to Pierce on the hillside that looked out over their ranch, and if you go out there today, you can still find those two headstones standing together, marking the place where two souls who found each other in the wild built something that would last forever. The ranch is still there, run by Pierce and Helena's great-great-grandkids now, and the story of how it all started is the stuff of family legend. They tell the one about Helena Cross, who could follow a track better than any scout you ever knew, and Pierce Northwood, the cowboy who asked her to ride with him one winter, and then spent the rest of his days being thankful she said yes. They tell about surviving a mountain of snow, about bringing villains to justice, about rescuing children, and about a love that could overcome anything put in its way. And on some winter nights, when the wind howls down from the peaks and the snow is piled deep, folks will swear they can see two riders up on the high trails. It's a man and a woman, side by side, partners, even after all this time, always tracking, always together, forever young and strong and in love. Of course, it is just a story, the kind of sweet, tall tale that springs up around a love as big as theirs. But the people who tell it get a smile on their face and a warmth in their soul, because the story of Pierce and Helena reminds us all of what can happen when two people put their complete trust in one another, when they stand against danger as one, when they build something real from nothing but faith, grit, and love. What they left behind was more than just land or cattle or even their children. Though all that was mighty important, their real legacy was the example they set for everyone else. They were living proof that a true partnership of equals could make something stronger than either one could be alone. They showed that love could get through hardship and danger and the passing of years. That two folks from completely different worlds could find common ground and build a life that counted for something. In the end, that was what folks remembered most about Pierce Northwood and Helena Cross. It was not the small details of that winter journey, not the names of the outlaws they caught or the kids they brought home safe, but the way they still looked at one another after decades of marriage, with respect and caring and a love that never wavered. People remembered the partnership, the fairness of it all, the simple truth that these two people had picked each other and then kept on picking each other every single day for all their lives. That was the story that got handed down through the years. It became woven into the history of Central City and all the ranches around it. It was the story that made young people believe in love and partnership, and the chance to build something that would stand the test of time. And at its core was a simple fact. Two people had met by chance, saw something special in each other, took a huge risk and rode into danger together, and they came out on the other side with something precious and rare and worth every bit of the fight. The mountains are still standing, timeless and unchanging, with their beautiful white peaks. And somewhere up in those mountains are the very trails that Pierce and Helena rode. The pass where they made it through the avalanche. The mining camp where they stood up to killers. The land itself remembers them. if a place can remember. And the people sure do remember them. They keep their story alive, passing it from one generation to the next. Because when all is said and done, that is what really matters. Not how much money you pile up or what your name is, not the number of cattle you own or the size of your ranch, but the love you shared, the lives you made better, and the mark you left on the world. Pierce and Helena knew that. They lived it. And they left behind a legacy that was worth more than any property or possession. They left behind solid proof that love could win against anything, that a partnership of equals could work miracles, and that two people with total trust in each other could take on any challenge and come out on top. They left behind children and grandchildren who carried their beliefs forward, who built on the foundation they had laid, who understood that real strength comes from standing together, not standing alone. And most important of all, they left behind a story. A beautiful, heart-wrenching, and inspiring story about a woman who could track better than any scout you ever knew, and a cowboy who was smart enough to see her gift and brave enough to ask her to ride with him one winter. A story about how that one question, that one decision to trust each other, led to a whole lifetime of love and partnership and happiness. It was a story worth telling, worth holding on to, and worth passing down to the kids and their kids as a shining example of what is possible when two brave hearts find one another out in the wild and decide that together is a whole lot better than being alone. And it was a story that would live on long after the last of their family was gone, long after the ranch itself had turned to dust. Because some stories are just too powerful to ever die, too important to ever forget, too beautiful to let them just fade away. The story of Pierce Northwood and Helena Cross was exactly that kind of story. And it would echo down through time, a testament to the power of love, the strength of partnership, and the lasting truth that sometimes the biggest adventures of your life start with one simple question. Will you ride with me this winter? Helena said yes. And with that one word, with that single choice, she kicked off a series of events that would change not only her own life, but the lives of so many others. She and Pierce rode together into those mountains, and they came back with justice done, children saved, and a love that would burn bright for a lifetime. That was their story, and it was a darn good one. The kind of story that needs to be told around a campfire on a cold winter night. The kind of story that can make folks believe in love all over again. The kind of story that reminds anyone who hears it that every now and then, happily ever after can come true. Even in the tough world of the Wild West, even in the middle of a harsh winter, even when it feels like everything is against you, all you really need is courage, a partner you can count on, and someone willing to ride with you through whatever storms are coming your way. Pierce and Helena found that in each other, and that simple fact made all the difference in the world.